My name is Daniel Ayiotis. I am the officer in charge, the director of the Military Archives. So for this presentation for the next 30, 35, 40 minutes, I'm going to talk about the history of the Military Archives. I describe it as crests and troughs because, especially within the decade of centenary, the Military Archives has really come into its own in terms of the collections we have, prominence, funding, support, that kind of thing as well. But it's been a story of, as I say here, crests and troughs, ups and downs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we came from, kind of focusing on the ups and the downs, just as a kind of methodology for talking you through the story. If you're really interested in it and you want to learn more, my book's on sale in the bookshop in there as well. Also, I think this jacket is attracting wasps as well, so you have to excuse me. So before I go into where we've come from and where we've been, I have a small 2-minute video that describes where the Military Archives is now to watch. So, here we go.
The Military Archives holds some of the most valuable records that we have as a state, largely dealing with events from, I suppose, the foundation of the Volunteers in 1913 up to last week. And part of the capital programme for the government for this decade of centenaries was to build a new building for the Military Archives. And hey presto, here it is.
There's a number of benefits for the visitor. Obviously, you have a very attractive building, but you also have additional comfort. We have more than double the research room size, so I mean we can now double the number of researchers, and we also have a significant lowering in retrieval time.
The records of the Irish Revolution are amazing. They're quite unlike any collection in any other country that I know of. They're amazing in their depth, in their breadth, in what they tell us not only about the independence struggle and the Irish military, but about the lives of those who fought and died, about the lives of those who fought and survived, about Irish society generally. They're absolutely extraordinary.
It means that we have made secure the story of our past, but also that we have left it open to further contributions. So it will just grow and grow, and I think future generations will be very grateful for it. It's a great, great credit to those who made it possible.
It coincided with the opening of our new building, a purpose-built archival facility in 2016. The records we have, as was mentioned there, we hold the most significant records to do with the Irish Revolution that exist in the country. The Military Service Pensions Collection, the Bureau of Military History, but also the likes of the 1922 Army Census, the Collins Papers, Civil War Operations and Intelligence Reports, Civil War Capture Documents. And I have this photograph to start with because it's IRA GHQ 1921, and the reason I have this is to point out the revolutionary beginnings of the Military Archives. Two of the individuals in this picture play a very significant role in getting the Military Archives to where it is today. The first one on the top left, the man in profile, is JJ Ginger O'Connell. And on the right-hand side, the man standing up is Pierce Beasley. And they're both very important figures in this story, as I'll explain. I always like this photograph to begin a presentation of the bombardment of the forecourts because I find it very symbolic in several ways. So, of course, you have the destruction of the Public Records Office, the beginning of, so we have the beginning of the modern Irish state. You have the destruction of centuries and centuries of valuable administrative records. But also, inside the building, I mentioned Ginger O'Connell. He was the Deputy Chief of Staff of the National Army, and it was his kidnapping by forces within the forecourts that precipitated the shelling. Outside in the street here, he's not in the photograph, and I don't think he is, you had a young medic, an NCO by the name of Niall Charles Harrington. Niall Charles Harrington went on to become an officer in the National Army, and he was the Deputy Director of the Military Archives for a long time as well. So he comes into the story later on. And just up the road, of course, O'Connell Street direction, you have Oscar Traynor, OC of the Dublin Brigade IRA, anti-treaty IRA. And he comes into the story significantly as well with the Bureau of Military History in the 1940s and 50s as well. So as well as being symbolic of how we began the state with the destruction of historical records, something that's actually repeated a couple of times during the first 10 years. I find this picture, personally as an archivist and as a military officer, quite symbolic and I suppose interesting and significant to start with. So let's start off with Pierce Beasley. So I'm sure many of you as historians and people with historical interest will know Pierce Beasley was the author of Michael Collins and the Making of the Modern Irish State, his biography of Collins, which was published in 26, I believe. So he was commissioned by the government to write Collins' biography in 1923, shortly after Collins' death, something he finished as a civilian, having left the army. As part of this historical research, he had the assistance of a Captain J.J. Burke. Now, J.J. Burke also had great revolutionary credentials. And J.J. Burke's job was to gather and consolidate and catalogue historical records from the revolutionary period. At the end of the Civil War, the army started to undergo massive demobilisation. The army, of course, I think upwards of something like, there could have been up to like 55,000 men in the army over the course of during the Civil War. It was a massive, too many for peacetime, and a massive drain of the resources of the state. So you had mass demobilisation going on. Beasley, however, approached the Chief of Staff and asked for the temporary establishment of a War Records Office, which we see as kind of the proto-military archives in a sense. Basically, he wanted some extra time to have this section set up to allow Burke to finish the job that he started. Unfortunately, it didn't come to anything. The Chief of Staff said, with massive demobilisation going on, I can't facilitate the setting up of another section. Beasley was disappointed. Either way, he left the army and finished his writing of Collins' biography, and Burke was returned back to his job in the publicity section of the National Army. So that was the seeds of the military archives, and in the book it's in the prologue section. So it's not the military archives as stuff, but as such, but it is, I suppose, the start of the collection and the identifying of keeping records as important to remember and document the revolutionary period. So this was going on while the Civil War was in progress, which I think is really significant. However, the requirement for military archives remained, and this is the man that established it. This is Colonel M.J. Costello. 1924, he was the Director of Intelligence. The reason the military archives was established in 1924 and the reason it fell under intelligence was because, first of all, looking after records and information was the job of the intelligence branch. And you also had two pieces of important legislation that constantly repeat within the story of the military archives. The 1923 Army Pensions Act and the 1924 Military Service Pensions Act. So with the establishment of these two acts, which the files of which are now what are known as the military service pensions collection, there was a requirement to be able to try and verify people's pre-true service. So the National Army, as a professional administrated army, kept good records. However, a guerrilla force doesn't keep those kind of records for obvious reasons. So there was a need to have the military archive set up to try and verify pre-true service for the Pensions Assessment Board. You also had a significant quantity of historical papers inherited by the military archives or by the National Army at that time. So you had all of the Civil War records that were both collected by J.J. Burke and that were generated by the National Army during that period. You also had a really interesting collection. You had the Kilmainham papers, which are found in a room in GHQ and Parkgate Street. Okay, so they were all inherited by the military archives. So that's why it was set up, 1924. And here we see a document from the military archives in 1924, from the Director of Intelligence in 1924, asking the Chief of Staff to establish the military archives as a subsection of intelligence. And I'll just read the paragraph here. It is respectfully requested that a proper military historical section should be set up into which will be gathered all material of historical value, including those papers at present in the custody of Mr. Galvin, who I'll mention next, the War Office at the Castle, which is also, I'll mention in a few slides as well, and various material relating to the Republican Army, its organisational activities since 1916, which material is at present in the hands of various officers and civilians throughout the country. Okay, so 1924. Now we mentioned Mr. Galvin, so this is Thomas Galvin on the left, who was a civilian clerk, and on the right we have Captain Alphonsus Blake. So these were the civilian and military men responsible for the military archives as a subsection from 1924 on. Okay. A very interesting point made by Thomas Galvin, and bear in mind this is 1924. He mentions that the Military Pensions Committee is at present engaged on information as regards claims. In the course of time, much information will be available from this source for the archives. And this is a theme that's repeated throughout the decades at the military archives. This recognition from as soon as these records are being generated, the military service pensions applications will form the most important documentary source of what happened during the revolution. Okay? Now bear in mind as well, at this time, only if you went pro-treaty you were eligible to get, if you went anti-treaty you weren't eligible to get a pension at this stage. You were under subsequent acts. So again, I suppose there would have been a slight bias built into the records, but then again, that was the exigencies of the time. Now Galvin, I'm really interested in Galvin. I find him a fascinating character. He left the army in 1926, and I'll mention that after this, but he put together this document in 1925, which was the draft establishment for the formation of the military archives. So people often ask me, what's your favourite document in the military archives? It's very hard for me really to pick one, but if I have to, it's this one. And I think it's because I'm an archivist as well. First of all, it shows the foresight and the organisation and the intellectual capacity that Galvin had, but also his objectives here on the right I find really interesting, because UCD have been running the Masters in Arch. Well, it was it was diploma previously, but it's the training course in archives and records management for the last 50 years. Back in 1925, Galvin identified objectives that resonate with professional archivists today. So the objectives for setting up the military archives he identified as the custody of military state papers, filing, indexing and cataloguing, preserving the records of the service, military research, relieving departments of surplus files, the reception of papers contributed from private sources and presses work. Okay, so these are objectives that are really relevant to the military archives today. Okay. So 1925, just to show, so we have a kind of positive start for the military archives, but again, so these are the peaks. We start coming into one or two troughs. So here's one we see just the danger of straightforward bureaucracy and human capriciousness, I suppose. Commandant William James Brennan Whitmore wrote to Colonel M.J. Costello in 1925 following Galvin's proposed establishment, and he uses poultry metaphors to describe a kind of potential danger to the running of the archives. He said, "There is a danger in putting up such a scheme as complete as this prematurely. Suppose that when the scheme, with civil service control and a good salary, comes before the Executive Council, and one of the members have a pullet that never laid any eggs, but is quite willing to hatch on a snug nest, and suppose that pullet is nominated over Galvin's head, what then? Are we to have two civilian archivists? For this reason, I avoid putting up a complete scheme in my letter of agitation on this subject." Okay, so we see kind of the matters of civilian control and bureaucracy coming into play. And also as well, this is a good point for me to point out, during the entire 10 years of Commandant government, the Chief of Staff repeatedly made the case to the Executive Council and to the Minister for Defence for the official establishment of the military archives as a kind of a national asset. Bear in mind, we didn't have any archival legislation in this country until the National Archives Act 1986, but repeatedly he petitioned the Minister for Defence to have the military archives established on an official national basis. This was blanked, refused, and eventually just declined, okay, for several reasons, which I could probably give a 40-minute talk on in and of itself, but I mean, I suppose you can draw your own conclusions, or buy the book, that goes into more detail as well. Another, I suppose, kind of a trough as well. I mentioned, this is kind of an interesting little story, I suppose. It's to do with a man called Thomas Markham. Now, Markham had been appointed by Collins as civilian officer in charge of Dublin Castle, a really vague kind of a title. And once Collins died, nobody could question Markham on exactly what that meant. But as far as he was concerned, he was civilian officer in charge at Dublin Castle, and this included charge of the records that were held there. So remember a few slides back, they talk about the War Office records held at the castle. These were identified as the corresponding papers to the Commandant papers, and these were something that Thomas Galvin and M.J. Costello and Alphonsus Blake identified as another significant collection to come to the military archives. However, Markham wasn't handing over these papers. He also wasn't handing over state records, the apparatus, the administrative apparatus of the state to the government itself. And he was writing them kind of cranky letters saying, "I lent you these records, when are you giving me them back?" So it came to this incident here in 1925, where they actually had to send people from the Board of Works to break into the offices he was staying in and take the records off him and put them into the charge of the Department of Finance. And they didn't come to the military archives in the end. And in the 30s, the Commandant papers ended up going to the National Library. But it just shows the kind of the threats that there were at the time. Little, I suppose you'd call them, little territorial silos of papers, you know. And especially looking at the history right up, I suppose, till the 1970s, going off on a slight tangent. You know, the kind of the memory of the Republican revolutionary generation was kind of, you know, the primary, probably the only kind of perspective we had on the revolution, you know, during those years. So an interesting little side note. We're interested to see that people knew where these records were and people wanted to have their own little fiefdoms over them. Anyway, that was Markham. Now, before I go on, in 1926, both Captain Blake and Thomas Galvin left the military archives. Okay, so we're coming into a trough. It had a good start, and then it just started for the next couple of years. It was just it was neglected, to be quite honest. Okay. Now, what's interesting is at the same time, the anti-treaty side were working on an archives from their point of view, and this was identified by Army intelligence. It's only in the last couple of decades within kind of archival thought and professional archival training that we've come to understand and view the archive as a contested space, one where you have several narratives, counter-narratives, some that get prominence, some that don't. Okay, that's something that archives are really good at addressing now. But back in 1926, Army intelligence identified the fact that the anti-treaty side, De Valera is mentioned in the next set of papers I'm going to show here, we're trying to put together an archive from their perspective. So first of all, we have this letter here. So remember, Pierce Beasley had gone off, become a civilian, taken state papers with him, and he was finishing off his biography of Collins. And this documents a raid by anti-treaty IRA on Beasley's home in which records were taken. And I'll just go here. I'm sorry about getting out of the way of the camera, but just so I can read it properly. The raid carried out some days ago on the premises of Pierce Beasley was at the instrumentality of Chadwick 6th Battalion Irregulars. Men from Dunleary carried out the raid. The reason given was that Beasley had many documents to be used in the publishing of his book, which it was believed would damage the irregular cause. If somebody is to ask me my second favourite document in the archives, it's probably this letter here. And it's from Thomas Galvin, Gaelicised version of his name, Thomas Galvin. And it documents the attempts by the anti-treaty side to put together an archive from their own perspective, including an emissary sent by Eamon de Valera to Ramsay MacDonald to collect certain papers to do with the treaty negotiations and the return to de Valera, who was at Gill's publishing house in Suffolk Street, and he refused to take the papers until he had Austin Stack there with him as a witness. I assume he because he was just out of prison, he thought perhaps it was a setup. But this document is really interesting, and if anybody's really interested, I have a copy. I have it in an article on my LinkedIn site, or if you want to email the archives, I'll send you a scan of it, because I find it really, really interesting to see the effort that they were putting into it from the anti-treaty side. So 1926, we have another period of the loss of records, very important records. So 1926, you have the responsibility for espionage within the state is handed over from the military to the guards, to the Garda Síochána. Now here's a report from the location and strength reports from Major Cotter, who was the Director of Intelligence in 1928. And he comments on the loss of these files, and the significance of the removal of these records, these intelligence records, from the Army to the Garda. He says, I personally have perused and dipped into a great many files in my efforts to make myself au fait with the resources of the Bureau. And that's the second Bureau, as intelligence was known. I am very disturbed indeed to find that machinery which was so effective in 1922 to 1924 has been handed over to the Civic Guard without the personnel accustomed to using it. And there is reason to believe that this machinery is not now effective. Now, I have spoken to the Garda Archive, and I would love to know where these records, these intelligence records that were handed over are, but I can't seem to find them. If anyone else knows, I'd love to know. Okay, so again, through not so much neglect as just administrative forethought, lack of forethought, I suppose, a very significant quantity of records are gone. We don't know where they are. So a bit of a peek now at this stage. Colonel J.J. Ginger O'Connell, you might remember I pointed him out in the picture of IRA GHQ. So 1929, Ginger becomes the Director of Intelligence for a short while. Okay, and during his tenure, he starts putting a lot of focus onto the cataloguing and the collection of records within intelligence branch. So at this stage, you had a reorganisation of the workings of intelligence branch, and within that he has a great focus on the importance of records as well. However, he only stays there until 1930. No, was it 31? I think it was late 31 he stayed there, and he was replaced by this man, Colonel Liam Archer. So we're coming up to 1932, the first section of the story of the military archives that coincides with the 10 years of Commandant in government. So we started off with the destruction of records in the forecourts, okay? And then we end the decade with the destruction of even more records, okay? And I think it's a sad way to bookend the decade, but it's important to understand the records that we don't have. Is anybody familiar with the burn order that was... So 1932, Fianna Fáil have come in from the cold into... So 26, they come into politics, and then 32, they come into power. Coming the nail, were concerned that there would be repercussions for the Civil War. So the burn order was issued by Desmond Fitzgerald, the Minister for Defence. And this directed that the army would destroy intelligence reports, including reports and particular supplied by agents and other persons, Secret Service vouchers, and really significantly, proceedings of military courts, including committee of officers, reports on and details of executions 1922 to 1923. So Archer and his team, they only had a few days turnaround. He directed his team at the archives, or the proto-archives I suppose it was at that stage, was known as the historical section for a while. He detailed to try and list as many of to catalogue the records before they were destroyed. Unfortunately, it was too short of a turnaround time, and these files had to be destroyed. They were lost in a fire, which is one of the reasons we're lacking records to do with Civil War executions. Okay. A really interesting one actually for me is just, again, drifting off on a bit of a tangent. I'm an archivist and a military officer, and I remember I was thinking about this in relation to the destruction of the burning of the Custom House in 1921 by the IRA. And I can kind of see it, without making a value judgment either way, I can see the really negative and the terrible aspect of the destruction of records. But from a military point of view, from a purely practical, pragmatic point of view, I can kind of see a validity to concerns about reprisals as well. Do I think it was the right thing to do, right or wrong? I try not to think about these things in terms of right and wrong. I find it easier when I'm dealing with history to look at things in terms of cause and effect, as sometimes chains of events are just put in motion that kind of gain a life of their own, you know? Anyway, 1932, Fianna Fáil come to power, okay? This man, E.V. O'Carroll, becomes Director of Intelligence in 1933, I think it was. So with Fianna Fáil coming to power, you see a lot more proactive engagement with documenting the revolutionary period throughout the country. Thomas Derrick, Minister for Education, I think, set up an early scheme to try with the Department of Education to try and document and catalogue people's experience during the revolution as well. Internally, within the Defence Forces, within intelligence, you had a project led by this man, Colonel E.V. O'Carroll, called the Anglo-Irish Conflict Project. And what he wanted to do, it was like like an early version of a precursor to the Bureau of Military History. And what he wanted to do was collect testimonies from serving officers with pre-truce experience, truce in the War of Independence. He wanted them to give their written testimony as to what they did during what he called the Anglo-Irish Conflict Project, the War of Independence. Now, this had the backing not only of the Chief of Staff, but also the President of the Executive Council, Eamon de Valera. So we see a shift in attitudes now from where the Chief of Staff has been blanked by the Minister for Defence to where this has been encouraged right up at the very top level of government as well. Now, we had limited success. We have a lot of correspondence in the military archives and the historical section collection from officers who wrote back. Some gave testimony, a lot said they get around to it when they can, and some just said no. I suppose on the one hand, it was still quite close, it was still quite raw, it was still, very live in people's experience and in their lives. But also it didn't have the systematic structure that the Bureau of Military History would have, as well as the benefit of the passing of time in the 40s and 50s as well. So it didn't really come to much. Also, as an archivist, I can see the bias there. Serving officers with pre-truce experience. Okay, so this isn't taking into account people who, I suppose, joined the National Army during the Civil War, or of course, very importantly, who took the anti-treaty side as well. We can see that now with about a century of hindsight. But back then, they had a different perspective. And again, I also don't judge that too harshly because, again, Dermot Ferreter wrote in the paper, I think a day or two ago, that in the future, people will look back at how we commemorated the decade of centenaries and they'll see the flaws in how we operated as well. So I don't judge Evie O'Carroll harshly at all. I think he was a pioneer and ahead of his time. But unfortunately, the Anglo-Irish conflict project didn't come to much. Now, Ginger O'Connell comes back in 1935, this time as the very first officer in charge of the military archives. Okay, so this was the first time that there was an official appointment within the Defence Forces establishment for an officer in charge of the military archives. And this really is, I suppose, another peak. So during his tenure from 1935 to 1944, the archives grew, it expanded, he took in more material. He carried on with the Anglo-Irish conflict project. He was still taking in testimonies, taking in private collections, but also looking outward. Okay, so for the military archives now, collaboration with other institutions is really important. Being collaborative and interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary is really important to us. Ginger was doing this back in the 1930s as well, although with really limited resources. Actually, in the book I have a photograph. I thought it was really interesting. He was getting fines from the RDS library for taking out books from his own account for the use of the military archives because he couldn't get the funding for books through the Army Finance Office. But a really great time for the military archive. So this is where it really kind of builds itself up before it vanishes for a while, as I'll come to now. So again, the military service pensions collection, 1935, Ginger O'Connell said this: as a result of the recent consideration and assessment of sources for the history of the 1913 to 1921 period, I have come to the conclusion that the most valuable existing source at the moment is constituted by the 1924 pension files, but could not be used for this purpose for many years to come. So I find it really fascinating to see that these people, they identified the future value of the military service pension applications. And we're lucky that they talk about years to come. We're lucky that we landed in the years to come. Okay, it's phenomenal. It's great. And I would imagine that this is one of the reasons that those files are still here and they were kept. They were seen as a value and they weren't disposed of. Because bear in mind, as I said, 1986, the first time we had National Archives legislation, which made it obligatory to make records available after 30 years, or if they are to be disposed of, it's done with a certificate from the Director of the National Archives. And these files would never in a million years get anywhere near be considered for disposal, for disposal cert anyway. Niall Charles Harrington, I mentioned he was an NCO, he was a medic during the Civil War, promoted to an officer during the Civil War in Kerry. He was O'Connell's deputy, and again, he was another, I suppose, real workhorse in terms of collecting records for the military archives and promoting it and building it up as well. 1944, O'Connell died quite suddenly and unexpectedly. Harrington took over nominally in charge of the military archives, but he had a lot more things, he had a lot more responsibility. So again, the archive itself just kind of pottered along. It wasn't really up to much during that period. And 1950, I think it was 59, he retired. But at the same time then, in 1959, coming into a reorganisation, every couple of years the Defence Forces has a reorganisation to make it fit for purpose. Coming into the Cold War, the Army, the Defence Forces, the whole Defence Forces was reorganised and the military archives was removed from the official establishment of the Defence Forces. Why, I don't know. Negligence, ignorance, I don't know, but it was taken completely off the establishment. So that's the first half of the story. Again, plenty of peaks and troughs, like I said there. In the meantime, so the archives, I always think of the archives during this period as archive with a lowercase a. So you don't have the intellectual control over it, but you have, it kind of annoys archivists when people say, oh, this is our archives and it's just a room full of records, or when people say, I'm a bit of an archivist myself, that kind of a thing. But so the archives was there. I mean, the material was there and it was nominally. There was actually a Captain C.S. Cox was his name, and he was over there. He was in charge of it for a little while. But in the meantime, we come back then to Oscar Traynor, who I mentioned, gone back to my picture from 1922, was up the road with the anti-treaty IRA. 1947, the Bureau of Military History was established to collect witness testimonies and contemporary documents to do with the revolutionary period. Dr. Eve Morrison, who's lecturing here sometime today as well, she did her PhD on this and she described it as a symbol of Republican reconciliation. And the real strength of the Bureau is that it was established under the auspices of the Defence Forces, but the people in charge running it on a full-time and part-time basis, they were taken from both pro and anti-treaty side as well. And the result of that is a collection of 1,773 witness statements that are held at the military archives and available on our website as well. Okay, so while the military archives itself wasn't operating, there was a small bit of back and forth with material between what was the military archives as a part of Army intelligence and the Bureau at that time as well. Okay, now, This man, Commandant Peter Young. I mentioned Ginger O'Connell as one of the massively important pillars of the military archives. This is the other pillar as well, Peter Young. Peter was an army officer in the 1970s. He was an assistant press officer based in Army Intelligence Branch. Okay, he gets there and he realised, right, there was an archives and there is material here. Peter fought to have it re-established. It's not an exaggeration to say that without Peter Young, the military archives as it is today, as you saw in that video at the start, would not be here. Peter fought and campaigned to have the military archives re-established. So dedicated was Peter that in 80 or 81, he served a 6-month tour of duty in Lebanon with UNIFIL, with the army. He impressed the senior Irish officer there, who was Lieutenant General William O'Callaghan, who was the senior officer in charge of UNIFIL. He was the force commander. Peter was offered a 2-year stint as assistant press officer to Timor Goxel, which was a really prestigious appointment, but he turned it down. And I have his letter again in the military archives, where he couldn't take it because the final review for the re-establishment of the military archives was currently underway, and he wanted to be in the country for that. 1982, the military archives was re-established, okay, thanks to Peter. It wasn't exactly as he wanted. Again, it wasn't on the official establishment. Initially, it was on an ad hoc basis, which within the organisation of the Defence Forces has its pitfalls, because once you're established, you have an official staffing, that needs to be filled, and it's easier to apply for logistical resources, financial resources as well. But still, it was a start. It was done. And this is where it was based at this stage, the Red House. At one stage in the 20s and 30s, it was based in Griffith Barracks. Not a lot of people know we were based in Griffith Barracks at one stage. But anyway, the Red House here, which was where Army Intelligence was also based as well. So Peter starts building up the archives at this stage during the 1980s. And coming up to this period, so we're looking for a better. So first of all, we're looking for a better accommodation. One of the places a lot of people don't realise that was looked at as a potential site for the military archives is the Magazine Fort in the Phoenix Park. So during the 1980s, there were plans that this would be both a national military museum and the home of the military archives. And there were architectural scoping exercises conducted as well. It would have been a great spot, when I think about it, because even like around the outside, you could have, kind of items of, robust material coverage like armoured vehicles, field guns, that kind of thing. I think it would have been a really brilliant site. Also, I'd love to be working in the Phoenix Park as well. It might be a better commute than trying to get into Rat Mines in the morning. There you go. But anyway, Peter's building up the archives all the time. Is a resource as good as it should be? No, not really. I mean, I think it was just the year after Peter had it re-established, for example, a year or two, an outgoing chief of staff directed that Peter should be transferred to a battalion for the good of his career. He needs more command experience. Fortunately, the incoming chief of staff decided, well, actually, you wait there until we find somebody. He was never moved. But again, it shows a lack of appreciation of the importance of the military archives at that time, because even now, I think it's been addressed a little bit more within the Defence Forces. There is this idea that, especially an officer, has to be a bit of a jack of all trades, do a couple of years here and move on. It doesn't really facilitate speciality. I'm lucky I've been at the archives for 8.5 years. Probably nobody wants me anywhere else now that I think about it, but it's probably a bad thing. But anyway, Peter's building up the archives. However, we have a bit of a trough now. I don't like putting up text-heavy slides, but this is important, I think. So as I mentioned again, coming into 1990, the National Archives Act 1986 is published. 1990, okay, the military archives is going to be set up as what's called an official place of deposit under the Act, which means we have a statutory position. We are the National Archives as far as the Defence Forces, the Army, Naval Service and Air Corps and the Department of Defence are concerned. However, in a letter that Peter wrote entitled Military Archives, I think something like Military Archives versus Department of Defence, he documents something that's really significant, and I think it was really good that this didn't come into effect. So let me just read this to you fully, if you don't mind. Since 1976, I have been collecting archival material, mainly military in origin, but also including 2 collections that originated in the Department of Defence. These are A files, 1922 to 1925. Has anybody used those files? They're brilliant files. They're really valuable. They were rescued from destruction in the late 1970s, the day before they were due to be collected for disposal. The department has never expressed an interest in them heretofore. They are of great historical value, and we have made extensive use of them in the past and regard them as an integral part of our Civil War files. Sorry, the context for this letter is the military archives is being proposed as an official place of deposit. And now the Department of Defence have said, well, we actually think we should have a Department of Defence archives separate to the military archives as well. And they've requested that these A files rescued in the late 1970s be given back to them. That's why Peter's writing this. He also mentions the next series, departmental 2-bar files, 25 to 46. Again, these files were dumped in an old block hut that was situated inside Planning and Research section in DFHQ. We spent approximately 18 months sorting through every single file, extracting those of archival value. Okay, so he's making the point, it would be fruitless handing over these collections to a departmental archives as they are military and historical. We have acquired knowledge and expertise over the years, and to hand over these files to someone who would have neither would not make sense. And again, a bit of a reflection of the handover of intelligence records to the guards, I think, there as well. However, didn't come to pass. 1990, the military archives became official place of deposit for the records of the Defence Forces, Department of Defence and Army Pensions Board. Very much a peak, and this means now we have statutory power now, okay? So very much a kind of a crest within the series of crests and troughs of the development of the military archives. Peter further develops the military archives. 1999, okay, the Bureau of Military History. Remember the records collected in the 40s and 50s, kept under lock and key in government buildings. If you gave a testimony, you got your own copy, you could do what you wanted with it. But for the first time now, they were kept under lock and key for, I think it was 50 years, reduced to 30 then, and then there was a review every 5 years, reduced to 3 years. In 1999, Peter and Katrina Crowe from the National Archives petitioned, with the support of a lot of historians, to have these files released for public inspection. And in 1999, they were successful. Okay. Unfortunately, it was the last thing that Peter did as the officer in charge of the military archives, because just 2 weeks later, he passed away. And I actually have a recording here. It's only a 60-second recording, but Katrina is reflecting on when they got the news that the Bureau of Military History records will be released to public inspection and deposited at the military archives. And it's quite poignant, but I think it's good to hear it in her own words.
So anyway, we went in at 11 o'clock. We were told by the personnel in both departments that the records were going to be released forthwith and that Peter should start preparing to have them brought to the military archives. And we were thrilled. So we came out at 12 o'clock into the sunshine and we said, we'd better go and have a glass of whiskey because this is like a historic day. We went down to the Stephen's Green Hotel and we had a whiskey each, toasted Bureau of Military History, left. I had to go back to Bishop Street and him to go back to the military archives. And he turned around the corner and blew me a kiss, and that was the last time I saw him alive. He died a week later. And it broke my heart. He was 49 years old. He had so much to offer. He was on the verge of this fantastic breakthrough, which he would have so enjoyed and made.
Okay. So you might have gathered from what I've told you so far that it seemed to be key personalities that kept the military archives alive and drove it on. So Peter passed away. Again, you know, it could have been a situation where the archives went into decline again, but it didn't because of his deputy, Captain, later Commandant Victor Lang, who is here. Okay, so Peter took the baton and kept the military archives alive during this time, kept it alive and helped it thrive as well. Now again, let's come to a really kind of an interesting little potential trough that turned into a peak, really. 2005, again, we're still looking for a new suitable place for the military archives to be located. Okay, and Collins Barracks, it had been handed over by the Defence Forces. The Army was based there and it was going to become a site of the National Museum of Ireland. There was an interdepartmental committee set up to look at a new home for the military archives. As I mentioned, the magazine fort fell through, and there was initially support from the National Museum. However, and again, these are from records at the military archives, at a meeting of the interdepartmental committee, which Victor attended, it transpired that the SecGen of Defence had met outside of the committee with the SecGen of Culture and Heritage and decided that they would propose that the military archive should in fact just be merged with the National Archives rather than left as is. The director of the National Museum at the time, who had previously supported it, came out in the meeting and said, well, actually, no, I don't really want the military archives here either. Okay. Fortunately, the director of the National Archives said, well, it would not make sense. This is a place of deposit already. It wouldn't make sense to merge this with the National Archives. So again, from a trough, we get to a peak, right? Victor comes back, he writes to the Chief of Staff and he says, right, if we're going to do this, we need to do it under our own auspices. We need to build something we can be proud of. This is our thing, right? And he proposed an old hospital block in the barracks, which was built in the 1840s. This is it during a fire. It had been used by the School of Music. This is it during a fire in the 1960s. You can see that. That's my office on the left, actually. So, and again, this was the hospital block before construction built, and you can see the poor condition it was in. Right. So, in 2005, Victor has the foresight to say this is where we should have our military archives. Fortunately, the decade of centenary starts to approach on the horizon, and we get to a really great kind of a crest. Okay, so 2006, the 90th anniversary of the 1916 Easter Rising, the Taoiseach announced that for the centenary, we're going to have the military service pension records, again, which have been repeated all the way through the story, made available for public inspection. 2008, a project team is hired, okay, of civilian archivists. Along with these civilian archivists for the project, who are based at the military archives, for the first time, the military archives gets its own dedicated civilian staff as well. So if anybody's familiar with the way it works, we have the main military archives and then the pensions project. They're co-located with us. The records are coming in under the same, National Archives Act mandate, but they work kind of autonomously, constantly just cataloguing and digitising those records. So the staffing starts to come on board. The interest starts to build. And then 2011, they have their first release of pension files. 2012, the Bureau of Military History files go online. They're digitised as well. And then as we approach, within the next couple of years, as we approach the decade of centenaries, it's announced that there will be a series of capital projects, permanent reminders to commemorate the 1960 Easter Rising. And one of those is to be the building, as we mentioned, as Katrina Crowe mentioned in the video at the very start, of a dedicated military archives building. And it was in the hospital block identified by Victor in 2005 in barracks, and it's something we can be proud of and looked after under our own auspices. Okay, and it came to pass. Okay, 2012, Victor retired. 2016, he was awarded an honorary doctorate as part of the decade of centenaries, honorary doctorates for people with serious contributions to Ireland's revolutionary historical memory. All right, I've been 41 minutes. I've gone a little bit over. And basically, it's such a fascinating, well, I find it fascinating. I hope you do too. And something I found so fascinating that I wanted to write a book about it. I think it's a positive thing if somebody likes their place of work so much that they want to write a book about it. Right, and that's a whistle-stop tour of the peaks and the crests and troughs of the story of the military archives. I've left lots and lots out because it's such a long history. It's such a deep and interesting, well, I think it's interesting. Right, thanks for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Daniel, Commandant Ayiotis, I'm sure there'll be people with questions. Can I ask one sort of slightly provocative question? One of the things that's very interesting in talking through was an apparent correlation between change in government administration and change in leadership. It was around presumably that wasn't formally the case, that these were not political appointees in the various precursors to the military archives, but was that political pressure or change of mood felt by them in what you read about them and their thinking about their work?
Within the archives, within the first 10 years under Commandant and Nail, no, I don't. No, I haven't come across it. I haven't noticed it because, there is a crossover. I mean, there is a kind of merging of staff from, pre-32 to post-32. They had a job they wanted to do. And bear in mind, these guys were embedded within Oakley and Ahern, and they weren't just in politics. They fought in the revolution. It just so happened that they split along Civil War lines, but these were guys who were grounded in the history and the experience and lived Oakley and Ahern from the volunteers through the IRA and the War of Independence right up to the Civil War split. So no, I don't really think the politics comes into it. I have a kind of a theory around why Ginger O'Connell was never promoted again. He was the only pre-truce general. He took 2 demotions following reorganisation, and he was never promoted again. The only one not promoted again. That could have had political reasons behind it, because he was critical of both De Valera while he was in the Volunteers, but he was also critical of Mulcahy's revival of the IRB as well. But again, that's a little bit of a tangent there. So I don't really see I see them using the momentum of political support, but I don't see any politicisation within the organisation itself. So to make a short answer long.
To actually touch on Simon's question there, you mentioned E.V. Carroll, I think his name was. His project kind of said he would focus on serving officers with pre-truce experience. It's interesting that even though De Valera
was the government at the time? Was there any push to kind of get a more anti-treaty perspective in there, or kind of, I suppose, says that there wasn't too much politicisation?
Not that I've come across, because I suppose Fianna Fáil were the establishment at that stage. Bear in mind, Fianna Fáil, when they were in power, when they needed to be, they were quite ruthless against the IRA themselves as well. I know, as I mentioned, Thomas Derrick had a project as well in conjunction with the National, I think those records are at the National Library at the moment. No, I don't think it would have been expedient either to focus on people who had taken the anti-treaty side and remain so. Because bear in mind, I mean, you could do that. You could interview people who'd taken the anti-treaty side on their 1916 service and their War of Independence service. So, I suppose it didn't really become a factor because they weren't looking at the Civil War. The Civil War was kind of ruled out, so they weren't looking at. There wasn't really a focus on Civil War activity itself. It was all, like I said, kind of pre-truce, you know. And that allows people who've gone anti-treaty to go, you know, to be interviewed as well, as long as you're not kind of covering what was kind of dangerous ground at the time.
I'm just wondering about the Garda intelligence files that you mentioned. The military files were handed over to the Garda.
Yeah.
The Garda seem to be a much more secretive organisation than the army. And are there any Garda intelligence files from the 1920s, say, available to the National Archives or the Department of Justice?
I don't know. I know that the Guards have an archive itself. But I'm kind of curious, and again, I'm not trying to hang them out to dry, but they're not a place to deposit under the National Archives Act, so I'm not sure why those records aren't all at the National Archives with the Department of Justice records. At the military archives itself, we do have, it's only a couple of files, but O'Duffy's reports to the Executive Council of Dáil Éireann, while he was also Garda Commissioner, he was General Officer commanding the forces for about 9 months during 1924, but I'm not aware of. I've asked the Garda Archive where they are. I'm not really sure where those intelligence files went.
And just another question. I wonder why John Mulcahy kept his papers from the Civil War, and in the 1970s gave them to UCD.
Yeah.
I was wondering why he didn't give them to the military archives.
Again, not being glib, because it didn't exist. Right. You know, 59 it was gone, and then 82 it was re-established. But I think also with people like that, because you know he had a political career as well. I think there's a little bit of kind of image, but as there is with the Bureau, I suppose, people giving testimony, there's a bit of kind of legacy making when people decide where they want to leave their archives, you know. We'll never rule out human factors, you know.
Just mine is more a comment than it's not only that the military and security these papers contain. In my own case, and the members of my family found corroboration that my grandfather, who would have come from Protestant evangelical background, from the 2 censuses, and he had Irish, because that was one of the columns. That surprised me, to be quite honest with you. And lo and behold, another cousin of mine working in one of those reports in 1947 that came from a man called O'Dwyer, who led in Tipperary the movement, described Clonalty, where he was director, and he was sound on the language, and was a member of the Irish language. So that's just the value, because we had corroboration of something which I thought was rather doubtful, that maybe he'd filled in the wrong column on the census, but no. And of course, subsequently that got written out of our family history. He was a serious Irish speaker.
Well, I suppose that's the value of records.
I mean, but it's just the wide scope. It's not just the military side of it.
Look, we always say that the more sources, you can't have too many sources,
exactly.
Which is why we recognise that we have state records are our mandate, but we have an oral history project where we can collect testimony from people who either don't make it into official records because of rank or whatever, but also they can put things on record that they don't want released yet, you know, if they can, you know, we can collect memory that way. We also have Unsha McGowan's papers his family gave us as well, so it's great to have that kind of anti-treaty IRA history from the 20s, 30s and 40s as well with us as well. And I think the military service pensions collection, especially because in 34 it was expanded to people who took the anti-treaty side and other organisations, it means the archives have become, rather than kind of seen as any kind of propaganda office, as an honest broker in terms of getting the memory of the revolution out there, which is a great thing.
Sorry.
No.
Yeah, just from a social history point of view, was it
Yeah.
easy for people to apply for their pensions, or would it have been, like someone who's better educated, would it have been easier for them to apply, or was anyone there to help people apply? You know.
Oh, that's an interesting question, because the pension files, they are really valuable as pieces of social history. I think once you could prove service and you had referees who would verify what you did, I mean, it was straightforward in that regard. But because there's money involved, I mean, the process is quite rigorous as well. And sometimes it's quite sad. I mean, the next book I'm doing, the book I have coming out next year is on discipline and religion in the army, from the Civil War to the Eucharistic Congress. I looked at a pension file where a soldier died fighting in the Civil War on the pro-treaty side, but his I suppose common law wife couldn't get compensation, and she ended up broke, and the children ended up in orphanages. Even though people like what's his name, Dermot O'Hegarty, who was director of operations at the time, C.B. O'Connor, who was the secretary of the department, they were all telling Mulcahy, you know, in other armies this is how it's done. If she's a dependent, she's a dependent. But again, Mulcahy and O'Sullivan were very staunch in their religious approach, and they said they didn't want people like this in the army. They didn't want people with what they called illegitimate, unmarried wives and unmarried wives they call it, and illegitimate children. They didn't want them. So sometimes, I mean, it was made harder because of personality and cultural mores as much as any administrative system. It's quite sad.
How far down the line are you with digitalisation of the pensions?
Oh, Cecile is the project manager. She'd give better figures, but there's still thousands more files to go. A couple more years.
And the pensions associated with medals, are they digitalised at all?
They haven't been digitised. They're catalogued. They're available in the reading room. But I think once the pension applications are all digitised, I would envisage them being digitised after that.
Are we talking years or?
A few years, yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of files. A lot more than they realised in 2006 when they said these will all be out for 2016.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk.
Oh, thanks.
Can I ask you something about the burn order in 1932 that you mentioned in passing? I just wondered what motivates that. Is it a fear of reprisals that we'll get rid of stuff that will incriminate us, or is it something else?
From anything I've read, any research, absolutely fear of reprisals.
Right. Yeah.
Quite simply, yeah. Because I mean, look, even today, even during the decade of centenaries, we're a century on, and executions are still a sensitive subject, you know.
Yeah.
Desperate.
No, it's hard to predict the future. You've mentioned peaks and troughs.
Yeah.
Throughout, do you anticipate any troughs coming up, or are we on a sound footing now?
I'll put it this way. I hope the momentum and the great democratisation of archives and the support and the understanding of the value of archives that has developed and been pushed and supported by government and by the state, the whole state, over the decade of centenaries, I hope that momentum remains. Because my concern is, very often if people want to weaponise history, what I've noticed is they'll take the records of the revolution and they'll completely overlay it over the modern state we have today. You know, that's why you sometimes have a conflation of, I don't know, executions and things that happened with kind of the modern times, and say, oh, look at this is where they came from and this is where we are now. But there's a whole century of state building between that, you know. So I hope that momentum goes so people have an understanding that it wasn't from 2022 we had a whole century of development and evolution of the state, you know, and merging of those threads, the pro and anti-treaty side. Like I said, I often tell people we have, I think, 4 barracks in the Defence Forces named after anti-treaty leaders, including Liam Lynch camp, Aiken barracks, a barracks named after a man who actually was locked up in the barracks and broke into the barracks, you know, blew it up. Cahill Brewer barracks, where I'm based, of course, and what's the other one? Mellows barracks, you know, who was executed in Galway. So, you know, the threads are, it's a tapestry, you know.
What lessons have been learned from the records of the revolution in terms of, say, UN service for Irish Defence Forces, or even history like 1969 and the Army's involvement in the border at that stage. Are those records kept by you? Are they being made available?
They are, yes. What, how, do you mean what lessons from then
Yes,
have applied
in terms
now?
of keeping the files and making them accessible.
Well, I think the value of records, especially to an organisation like the Defence Force, an organisation that keeps good records, the significance of good record keeping is becoming more obvious to people. I mean, this is, I think, if I talk about wider departments of state, it's an issue trying to get people to understand that the records you have now, right, that's what those pension records were 100 years ago. They were just an administrative file sitting on somebody's desk. So I think there is a growing awareness of the collections. I actually mentioned in the introduction to the book that when I heard about the military archives, I knew a guy, Steve McOwen, who was my predecessor. We always pictured him in this kind of candlelit room at a desk, you know, with a quill and he's dusty. And people still have that idea. They just think we have people just throw in an old bag of records and we stick them on a shelf and we just kind of potter around. But you know, I think the awareness has grown, you know.
Just following on that question there, do you see any possibility of a burn order being reintroduced at the moment?
Absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not, no. But first of all, it would be illegal.
Yeah.
You know? And second of all, it would be illegal.
Well, I was just thinking
it would be illegal.
from the point of view from 1969 on, a lot of things have happened.
No, because the only thing that we take in records, including secret and top secret, the only thing that it's only a matter of time. All records, everything needs to become accessible eventually. There's 3 reasons under the National Archives Act you can withhold records from public inspection. If it's not in the public interest, it would be dangerous to people living or would cause serious distress, or if it would be a breach of statutory obligation. And again, if you do apply for records to be withheld, it needs to be countersigned by a consenting officer in the Department. The Taoiseach will review every 5 years as well. And the reason, especially with so much good archival training and professional archivists being turned out now, especially, I mean, the course in UCD has doubled in size over the last couple of years. The reason we have an archive, the reason you have a state archive, it's not just to go in and say, oh, wasn't Grandad a bit of a rogue back in 1947? The role of an archive is as an agent of accountability of the state and advocacy for the citizens of the state by ensuring access to documents, recording decisions made on their behalf by decision makers in the country. That's why we have archives. That's why we have a National Archives Act. Right? It's not just historical curiosity. Historical curiosity is great, but you know, that's why you have an archive. And that's where I think people should demand records. Rather than saying, oh, there's no records from such and such in the National Archives. Well, ask why. Ask why they're not there.
Are there any records from the revolutionary period that are still withheld for whatever reasons that were mentioned there?
No, that's an interesting one. People still ask us, they regularly say, oh, there must be something from the Civil War that's not out yet, you know. Kind of, we look for, I must say, in 2012, we were moved from intelligence branch to public relations branch of the Defence Forces, which is brilliant because it's about getting stuff out there. We look for reasons to get records out rather than reasons to withhold them. There's not, and I mean, whatever about sensitivities of the Civil War, firstly, it was a century ago. We need to get it. We're archivists. Our job is to get this information out there. And if people don't, and if it is embarrassing to the state, that's the job. It's supposed to be, you know. We're supposed to hold, you know, air the dirty laundry. That's the job. And secondly, as well, people often, sometimes they kind of think that, you know, we'll get a call from somebody in government and they'll say, don't release those papers from 1923. It's embarrassing. That just doesn't happen, like, you know. Just, so no. And the more we have them. If any records aren't released, it's anywhere, it's because of a resource issue. Somebody's waiting to get it, like the pension records. You know, those guys are up there, 5 archivists and 4 scanners, constantly cataloguing and scanning. It's a matter of time and resources, you know. But not that I know of. There's nothing. Not
I came across a note. I was doing research about 10 years ago, and it was to do with the kidnapping of 3 British officers from West Cork and their driver.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite understand the note, but it seemed to indicate there was some record there that wasn't available.
Was it in the Bureau of Military History?
It was in the military archives.
All I can think, firstly, if it wasn't the Bureau, the digitised records, there were some abstractions made where there was fear there could be serious distress or danger to people still living in the 90s. We reviewed that, and there's absolutely no case for them now. We are working on getting the higher resolution, completely unredacted. It's only a small amount of redactions, but getting those available on our website. That's currently in progress. But if you do come across a bureau statement and there is anything redacted, if you email us, we will send it out as well. And also, if it's a pension file, 99.9% of anything withheld in those files is usually to do with data protection. So in pension files, there could be people still living, you know. Occasionally you come across awful things like, you know, records of incest as well, and, you know, there's somebody still alive and that could affect them. But anytime that's the tricky one, you know. We hold records from public inspection or sections almost exclusively for people's private data. And people kind of assume, oh, you know, the smoking gun is here, you know, the man who shot Colin's name is in there, and you're hiding it, you know. No, very prosaic, quite boring, to be honest. You know.
Well, Daniel, thank you. That can't be said of the rest of the talk. I hope we find ourselves on a permanent crest. Two ways in which you can ensure this. Daniel's book is available, so please do consider buying it. And Eve Morrison, who you mentioned as one of the students of the Bureau's work, she's going to be speaking next in the Octagon. We've made up a little bit of time, so what I'd suggest is that we have our next talks at 22:01, if that's all right. But in the meantime, I'd like you all to thank Daniel.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. Thanks.